the sounding of the call. Buck earned $1,600 in 5 minutes for John Thornton. The money made it possible for Thornton to pay off his debts and to journey with his partners into the East. They were searching for a fabled lost mine, the history of which was as old as the history of the country. Many men had looked for it, but few had found it, and more than a few had never returned from the search. This lost mine was steep in tragedy and mystery. No one knew who the first man there had been. Even the oldest traditions knew nothing of him. From the beginning, there had been an old run-down cabin. Dying men had sworn that both the cabin and the mine were there. As proof, they showed nuggets that were unlike any known grade of gold in the Northland. But no living man had worked this mine. Wherefore, John Thornton and Pete and Hans, with Buck and half a dozen other dogs, headed into the East on an unknown trail. They hoped to succeed where other men and dogs, as good as themselves, had failed. They sledded 70 miles up the Yukon, swung to the left of the Stewart River, past the Mayo and the McQuestion, and held on until the Stewart itself became a little stream among the high mountains of the Continental Divide. John Thornton was afraid of the wild. Unafraid of the wild. Absolutely unafraid, sorry. With a handful of salt and a rifle, he could plunge into the wilderness and get along wherever he pleased, and as long as time as he pleased. He hunted his dinner during the day's travel. If he did not find dinner, he would keep on traveling. Sure, the sooner or later he would come to it. So, on his great journey into the East, nothing but meat was on the menu. The sled was loaded mainly with ammunition and tools. They did not travel according to any schedule. To Buck, it was an unending delight, this hunting, fishing, and wandering through strange places. For weeks at a time, they would go on steadily, day after day, and for weeks on end, they would camp. While the dogs loafed, the men buried holes through the frozen mud and gravel and washed countless pans of dirt by the heat of the fire. Sometimes they went hungry. Sometimes they feasted noisily. It all depended on how much game there was and their luck in hunting it. Summer came. Dogs and men backpacked, rafted across mountain lakes, and traveled along unknown rivers in slender boats made from the forest. The months came and went, back and forth, they crossed through the wilderness, where there were no men, and yet where men had once been in the lost cabin were true. They went across divides in the summer snowstorms. They shivered under the midnight sun on the naked mountain between the timberline and the eternal snows. They dropped into the summer valleys amid swarms of gnats and flies, and in the shadow of the glaciers they picked strawberries and flowers as ripe and as pretty as any in the Southland. In the fall of the year they entered a weird lake country, silent and sad. Birds had been there, but now there were no signs of life. There was only the blowing of chilled winds and the forming of ice in the sheltered places, and the quiet, sad splashing of waves on a lonely beach. They wandered through another winter on the erased trail of men who had gone before. Once they came a path ablaze through the forest, and it was an ancient path of the lost cabin seemed very near. But the path began nowhere and ended nowhere, and it remained a mystery. Another time they found the wreckage of a hunting lodge. Amid the shreds of rotten blankets, John Thornton found a long-barreled flintlock gun. He recognized it as the Hudson Bay Company gun of the younger days of the Northwest, when such a gun was worth its height in a pile up high of beaver skin. But there was no hint as to who had built the lodge or left the gun amid the blankets. Spring came on once more, and at the end of all their wandering they found not the lost cabin, but a shallow sand bed where the gold shone like yellow butter across the bottom of the washing pan. They looked no further. Each day of work earned them thousands of dollars in gold dust and nuggets, and they worked every day. The gold was sacked in moose hide bags, 50 pounds to the bag, and piled like firewood outside the lodge. They worked like giants, the days following each other's like dreams as they heaped the treasure up. There was nothing for dogs to do except now, then hauling in its meat when Thornton killed it. Buck spent long hours musing by the fire. Now that there was little work to be done, the vision of the shorter, hairy-legged man came to him more and more often. Often blinking by the fire, Buck wandered with him, page 96, in the other world which he remembered. The chief feature of this older world seemed to be fear. Buck watched the hairy man sleep by the fire, his head between his knees and his hands clasped above. Buck saw that the man slept restlessly and many twitches in awakening, and at such times he would look fearfully into the darkness and throw more wood on the fire. Sometimes they walked along a beach, where the hairy man gathered shells and ate them as he gathered. Then the man would look everywhere for hidden danger, and he would prepare to run like the wind when it appeared. Sometimes he crept noiselessly through the forest, and Buck at the hairy man's heels. Both of them were alert and watchful, for the man heard and smelled as sharply as Buck. The hairy man could spring into a tree and travel ahead as fast as on the ground. He swung by the arm from limb to limb, letting go and catching, never falling, never missing his grip. In fact, he seemed so much at home in the trees as on the ground. Buck had memories of this night, spending guarding a tree while the hairy man roosted above, holding on tightly as he slept. And closely related to the vision of this hairy man was the call that still sounded in the depths of the forest. It filled him with a great unrest and strange desires. He was aware of the wild longing and the stirring, for he knew not what. Sometimes he followed the call into the forest, looking for it as though it were something he could touch. He would bark softly and definitely, depending on his mood. He could poke his nose into a cool, wooded moss and into the black soil where the long grasses grew, and snort with joy at the fat earth smell. Or he would crouch for hours, as if hiding behind the fungus-covered trees of fallen trees, wide-eyed and wide-eared to all that moved and sounded about. It might be that, lying in his way, he hoped to capture this call that he could not understand. But he did not know why he did these things. He was driven to do them, and he did not reason about them at all. More on page 97. Overpowering urges took hold of him. He would be lying in camp, dozing lazily in the heat of the day, when suddenly his head would lift and his ears cocked up, listening intently. He would spring to his feet and dash away on and on for hours through the forest's aisles and across the open spaces. He loved to run down the dry creek beds, to creep and spy upon the bird life in the woods. For a day at a time he would lie in the underbrush, where he could watch the partridges beating their wings and strutting up and down. But he especially loved to run in the dim twilight of the summer midnights. He listened to the quiet, sleepy murmurs of the forest, reading signs and sounds as men may read a book. And at all times he followed after the mystery, something that called, waking or sleeping, for him to come. One night he sprang from his sleep with a start, eager-eyed, nostril-scenting, his mane bristling. From the forest came a call, or one note of it, for the call was many notes, clear and definite as never before. It was a long, drawn howl, like the noise made by a husky dog, and at the same time not like it. But Buck knew it in the old familiar ways of the sound that he had heard before. He sprang from his sleeping camp, and in the swift silence dashed through the woods, and he grew closer to the cry, and he went more slowly and cautiously in every movement, until he came to an open place among the trees. Looking out, he saw a long, lean timber wolf sitting up straight with his nose pointed to the sky. Buck had made no noise, yet the wolf stopped its howling, and he tried to sense his presence. Buck moved cautiously into the open, half crouching, body gathering compactly together, tail straight and stiff, feet falling with unusual care. Every movement advertised a mixture of danger and friendliness. It was the threatening truce that marked the meeting of the wild animal. But the wolf ran off as soon as it saw him. Buck followed, leaping wildly in the frantic eagerness to catch up. He ran him into the blind channels to the bed of the creek, where some fallen logs barred the way. And the wolf whirled around, turning on his hind legs in the same way as Joe of all the cornered husky dogs. He was snarling and bristling, clicking his teeth together in a rapid, unbroken series of snaps. Buck did not attack. Instead, he circled about him with friendly advances, and the wolf was suspicious and afraid. Buck weighed 3 times as much as this wolf. His head barely reached Buck's shoulders. Watching his chance, he ran away quickly, and the chase began again. Time and time again, he would be cornered, and the thing repeated. The wolf was in poor condition, or Buck could not have caught up with him as so easily. He would run until Buck's head was even with his, and he would whirl around to protect himself, only to run away again at the first chance. He's running with a wolf. He's making wolf friends. But in the end, Buck's stubbornness was rewarded, and the wolf, finding that no harm was meant, finally sniffed noses at him. Then he became friendly and played in a nervous, partly shy way with the fiercest of animals pretended not to be fierce. After some time of this, the wolf started off on an easy walk that plainly showed that he was going somewhere. He wanted it to be made clear that he wanted Buck to come with him, and they ran side by side through the dull, gloomy twilight, straight up the creek bed into a gorge and across the bleak divide where the creek began. On the opposite slope, they came down into the level country with great stretches of forest and many streams. Through the great stretches they ran steadily, hour after hour, as the sun rose higher and the day grew warmer. Buck was wildly glad. He knew he was at last, answering the call, running by the side of his wild wood brother toward the place from which the call surely came. Old memories were coming to him fast, and he was excited by them in the same way that he had once been excited by the real things of which these memories were the shadows. He had done this thing before, somewhere in the other dimly remembered world, that he was doing it again now, running free in the open, the unpacked earth underfoot, and the wide sky overhead. They stopped by a running stream to drink, and stopping, Buck remembered John Thornton. He sat down. The wolf started on toward the place from which the call surely came. Then he returned to Buck, sniffing noses and acting as if to encourage him. But Buck turned about and started slowly on the return track. For the better part of an hour, the wild brother ran by its side, whining softly. Then he sat down, pointed his nose upward, and howled. It was a mournful howl, and as Buck kept steadily on his way, he heard it growing faint and fainter until it was lost in the distance. Paid 100, please. John Thornton was eating dinner as Buck dashed into camp and jumped on him in a frenzy of affection, knocking him down and jumping in him, licking his face and biting his hands. John Thornton described it as playing the General Tom Fool, and at the same time shaking Buck back and forth and cursing him lovingly. For 2 days and nights, Buck never left his camp, never left Thornton out of his sight, and he followed him around at work, watched him while he ate, and saw him into his blankets at night and out of them into the morning. But after 2 days, the call of the forest began to sound more strongly than ever, and Buck's restlessness came back to him. He was haunted by the memories of the wild brother and the smiling land beyond the divide, and the running side by side through the wild forest stretches. Once again he began wandering into the woods, but the wild brother did not return, and though Buck listened through the long nights, he never heard the mournful howl. He began to sleep out at night, staying away from camp for days at a time. Once he crossed the divide at the head of the creek and went down to the land of the timber and streams. He wandered there for a week, looking unsuccessfully for signs of the wild brother. He killed his meat as he traveled, and he moved with the long, easy lope that seemed never to grow tired. He fished for salmon in the broad stream that emptied somewhere into the sea. But this same stream he killed a large black bear, which had been blinded by mosquitoes while fishing, and raged helplessly through the forest. Even so, it was a hard fight, and it brought out the last unused, fiercest part of Buck's nature. 2 days later, he returned to his kill and found a dozen wolverines quarreling over it. He scattered them like calves, and the ones that got away left 2 behind who would never quarrel again. The longing for blood became stronger than ever before. He was a killer, a thing preyed, living on the things that lived. He lived alone, without help, depending on his own strength and mastery. He survived and succeeded in an unfriendly environment where only the strong survive. And because of this, he developed a great pride in himself, which showed in his appearance. It showed in all of his movements, in the play of every muscle, in the way he carried himself. It made his glorious furry coat even more glorious, except for the stray brown on his muzzle and above his eyes, and for the splash of white in the middle of his chest. He might have been mistaken as a gigantic wolf, larger than the largest of breed. From his St. Bernard father he inherited the size and weight, but he was shaped like his shepherd mother. His muzzle was long and wolf-like, except that it was larger than the muzzle of any wolf. His head, somewhat broader, was the wolf head on a massive scale. His cunning was wolf cunning and wild cunning. His intelligence was shepherd intelligence and St. Bernard intelligence. All of this, plus the experience gained in the fiercest of schools, made him an awesome a creature as any that ever roamed the wild. Living on straight meat diet, he was in the full flower at the high tide of his life, overflowing with vigor and vitality. When Thornton passed his hand along Buck's back, a snapping and a crackling followed the hand as each hair let go its built-up magnetism. Page 102. Every part, brain and body, nerve tissue and fiber, was turned into the most perfect pitch, and between all the parts there was a perfect balance. When action was needed, he responded as quickly as lightning. As quickly as a husky dog was to attack or defend, Buck was twice as fast. He saw a movement or heard a sound, and he responded while other dogs were still have been listening. His muscles were charged with vitality and a snap into play sharply like a steel springs. Life streamed through him in a splendid flood until it seemed that he would explode with joy. "Never was there such a dog," said John Thornton one day as his partners watched Buck march out of camp. "When he was made, the mold was broke," said Pete. "By jingo, I think so myself," said Hans. They saw him march out of camp, but they did not see the instant and terrible change that took place in him as soon as he entered the forest. He no longer marched. He became a thing of the wild, stealing along, soft, cat-footed, as passing shadows that appeared and disappeared among the shadows. He knew how to take advantage of every hiding place, how to crawl on his belly like a snake, and how, like a snake, to leap and strike. He could take a bird from his nest, kill a rabbit as it slept, and snap the little chipmunks in mid-air. Fish in open pools were not quick enough to escape him. He caught beavers mending their dams, no matter how careful they were. He killed to eat, not for cruelty, but he preferred to eat what he killed himself. So a hidden humor ran through his actions. He liked to steal up on squirrels, and when he had almost caught them, to let them go, chattering in a deathly fear. Buck's trying to be silly. As the fall of the year came on, the moose appeared in larger numbers, moving slowly down to spend the winters into the lower, less harsh valleys. Buck had already dragged down a stray part-grown calf, but he wished strongly for a larger and more difficult game, and he came upon it one day at the divide of the head of the creek. A band, or group, of 20 moose had crossed over from the land of stream and timber, and the chief among them was a great bull. He was in a savage temper, standing over 6 feet from the ground. He was as tough as an enemy as Buck could have wished. Back and forth the bull tossed his great antlers, which branched to 14 points and were 7 feet from tip to tip. His small eyes burned with a vicious and bitter light, and while he roared with fury at the sight of Buck, a feathered arrow end stuck out from the side, which accounted for his savageness. Guided by the instinct from the old hunting days of the primitive world, Buck proceeded to cut the bull off from the herd, to single him out, to take him one-on-one. It was not an easy task. He would bark and dance about in front of the bull, just out of reach of those great antlers and terrible hoofs, which could have stamped his life out in a single blow. Unable to turn his back on Buck and go away, the bull was driven into fits of rage. Then he charged Buck, who retreated shrewdly, luring him on by pretending to be unable to escape. But when Buck was separated in this way from the rest of the moose, 2 or 3 of the younger bulls would charge Buck and enable the wounded bull to rejoin the herd. So they were taking care of each other, the moose were. There is a patience of the wild that is dogged, page 104, and tireless, persistent as life itself. It is the patience that holds the spider in its web motionless for the endless hours, and the snake in its coil, and the panther in its hiding place. This patience belonged in particular to life when it is hunting its living food, and it belonged to Buck as he clung to the herd, slowing its march, irritating the younger bulls, and worrying the cows with their half-grown calves, and driving the wounded bull mad with helpless rage. For a half a day this continued. Buck attacked from all sides, surrounding the herd like a whirlwind of danger, cutting out his victim as soon as it rejoined the herd. He wore out the patience of his victims, which it was not as great a patience as that of the hunter. And as the day wore along and the sun dropped to its bed in the northwest, the darkness had come back, and the night were 6 hours long. The young bulls were more and more unwilling to come to the aid of their leader, and it seemed that they would never shake off the single-minded creature that held them back. Besides, it was not the life of the herd that was threatened, or the lives of the young bulls. The life of only one member was demanded, which was not so close to their own lives, and in the end, they were willing to pay the price. As twilight fell, the old bull stood over lowered head, watching his herd, the cows he had known, the calves he had fathered, and the bulls he had mastered. And as they plodded along, through the fading light, he could not follow, for this merciless fanged terror that would not let him go leapt on in front of his nose. He weighed more than 1,300 pounds, and he had lived a long, strong life full of fight and struggle. And at the end he faced death at the teeth of a creature whose head did not reach above his great knuckled knees, page 105. From then on, night and day, Buck never left his prey. He never gave it a moment's rest, never allowed it to eat the leaves of the trees or the shoots of birch or the willow. Nor did he give the wounded bull a chance to satisfy his burning thirst in the slender trickling streams they crossed. Often in desperation, the bull burst into long stretches of running, and at such times Buck did not try to stop him, but loped easily at his heels. He was satisfied the way the game was being played. He would lie down when the moose stood still, and he attacked fiercely when he tried to eat or drink. The great head drooped more and more under the tree of antlers, and the trot grew weak and weaker. He stood standing for long periods with his nose to the ground and his sad ears drooping limply. But Buck found more time to get water for himself and to rest, and at such times, panting with the red tongue and his eyes fixed on the bull, it seemed to Buck that a change was coming. He could feel a new stir in the land. The moose were coming into the land, so other kinds of life were also coming. Forest and streams and air seemed alive with their presence. The news of it did not reach him by sight or sound or smell, but by some other sense. He heard nothing, saw nothing, yet he knew that the land was somehow different, that strange things were in it. He decided to look into it after he finished the business at hand. At last, at the end of the 4th day, he pulled the great moose down. For a day and a night he remained by the kill, eating and sleeping. Then, rested and strong, he turned his face toward camp and John Thornton, page 106. He broke into a long, easy lope and went on hour after hour, always sure of the way, heading straight home. Through strange country, he had a sureness of direction that put man and his compass to shame. And as he went along, he became more and more aware of the new stir in the land. There was life in it, different from the life that had been there throughout the summer. No longer did this fact come to him in some mysterious way. The birds talked about it, the squirrels chattered about it, and the breezes whispered of it. Several times he stopped and drew in the fresh morning air in great sniffs, reading a message which made him leap on in greater speed. He was weighed down with the sense that a disaster was happening, or perhaps had already happened. And as he crossed the last watershed and dropped down into the valley toward camp, he proceeded with greater caution. 3 miles away, he came upon a fresh trail that sent his neck hair rippling and bristling. It led straight towards camp and John Thornton. Buck hurried on, swiftly but cautiously, every nerve straining and tense. He took in all the many details that told the story. All but the end of it. His nose told him about these creatures who had traveled there just before him. He noticed the silence of the forest. The bird life had flown away. The squirrels were in hiding. He only saw a sleek gray fellow flattened against a gray dead limb, so that he seemed to be part of it. As Buck slid along a gliding shadow, his nose was jerked suddenly to the side as though a force had pulled it. He followed the new scent into the thicket and found Night. He was laying on his side, dead, where he had dragged himself. An arrow, head and feathers, stuck out from both sides of his body. Page 107. 100 yards farther, Buck came upon one of the sled dogs Thornton had bought in Dawson. This dog was thrashing about in death struggle directly on the trail. Buck passed around him without stopping. From the camp came the faint sound of many voices rising and falling in a sing-song chant. Edging forward to the edge of the clearing, Buck found Hans, lying on his face, stuck full of arrows, like a porcupine. And at the same time, Buck peered out where the lodge had been. What he saw made his hair leap straight up on his neck and shoulders. A strong rush of overpowering rage swept over him. He did not know that he had growled, but he growled fiercely. For the last time in his life, he allowed emotion to overcome reason, and it was because of his great love for John Thornton that he lost his head. He went crazy. The Yehots, or the Indian tribe, were dancing about the wreckage of the lodge when they heard a fearful roaring. They saw an animal rushing upon them like none they had ever seen before. It was Buck, a live hurricane of fury, throwing himself on them in a frenzy to destroy. He sprang at the man in the front. It was the chief of the Yehots, ripping his throat wide open until he tore the jugular, spouted a fountain of blood. He did not pause over this victim, but at the next bound and tore wide the throat of a second man. There was no way to resist him. He plunged among them, tearing, destroying in a constant and terrific motion. His movements were so fast and the Indians were so close together, they shot one another with arrows instead of hitting Buck. One young hunter, throwing a spear at Buck, drove it through the chest of another hunter with such force that it came out his back. Then a panic seized the Yeehats. They fled in terror into the woods, announcing as they fled the coming of an evil spirit. As Buck was truly the devil in the body of a dog, he raged at their heels and dragged them down like deer as they raced through the trees. It was a disastrous day for the Yeehats. They scattered far and wide over the country. It was not until a week later that the last of their survivors gathered together in a lower valley and counted their losses. As for Buck, he grew tired of the pursuit and returned to the ruined camp. He found Pete where he had been killed in his blankets in the first moment of surprise. Thornton's desperate struggle left a trail of fresh scent in the ground, and Buck scented every single detail of it down to the edge of a deep pool. By the edge, head and feet in the water lay Skeet, faithful to the last. The pool itself, muddy and discolored from the gold mining, hid what it contained. And it contained John Thornton, for Buck followed his traces into the water, and no trace led away. All day, Buck brooded by the pool, or wandered restlessly around the camp. He knew what death was, and he knew John Thornton was dead. It left a great emptiness in him, somewhat like hunger, but an emptiness that ached, which food could not fill. At times, when he paused to look over the bodies of the Yeehats, he forgot the pain of it, and at such times he was aware of the great pride in himself, a greater pride than any he had yet known. He had killed man, the noblest of all, and he had killed it in the face of the law of the club and fang. He sniffed the bodies curiously. They had died so easily. It was harder to kill a husky dog than them. They were no match at all, were it not for their arrows and spears and clubs, and from now on he would be unafraid of them, except when they carried their arrows and spears and clubs. Night came on, and the full moon rose higher into the trees and to the sky, lighting the land until it lay bathed in the ghostly mind. And with the coming of the night, brooding and mourning by the pool, Buck became aware of a new life in the forest in addition to that of the Yeehats. He stood up, listening and scenting. From far away drifted a faint, sharp yelp, followed by a chorus of sharp yelps. And as the moments passed, the yelps grew closer and louder. Again, Buck knew them as a thing heard in the other world of his memory. He walked to the center of the open space and listened. It was the call, the many-noted call, sounding more attractive and forceful than ever before. And as never before, he was ready to obey. John Thornton was dead. The last tie was broken. Man and the claims of mankind no longer bound him. The wolves hunted their living meat as the Yeehats had hunted it, following the migrating moose. Following the moose, the wolf pack made the last cross over the land of the stream and the timbers and invaded Buck's Valley. Into the clearing where the moonlight streamed, they poured into the silvery flood. Buck stood in the center of the clearing, waiting for them, motionless as a statue. He stood so large and still that they were awed, and at a moment's silence fell. Then the boldest one leapt straight for him, and like a flash Buck struck, breaking the neck. Page 110. Then he stood without movement, as before, and while the stricken wolf rolled laying in agony behind him, 3 others tried in quick order. One after another, the others drew back, blood streaming from the slashed throats or shoulders. This was enough to push the whole pack forward. Crowded together, blocked and confused by its eagerness to pull down their prey. Buck's marvelous quickness and skill served him well. Turning on his hind legs, snapping and gashing, he was everywhere at once. But to prevent them from getting behind him, he was forced back, down, past the pool and into the creek bed, until he came up against a high graveled bank. He worked along the right angle in the bank, which the men had made in the course of mining. In this angle he came to bay, protected on 3 sides and with nothing to do but face the front. Buck has backed himself into a corner. He faced it so well that after half an hour the wolves drew back uneasily. The tongues of them were out and lolling, and the white fangs showing cruelly white in the moonlight. Some were lying down with their heads raised and their ears forward. Others stood on their feet watching him. Still others were lapping water from the pool. One wolf, long, lean, and gray, advanced cautiously in a friendly manner. Buck recognized the wild brother from whom he had run for a night and a day, and he was whining softly, and as Buck whined, they touched noses. Then a wolf, gaunt and battle-scarred, came forward. Buck worked his lips into the beginning of a snarl, but sniffed noses with him. Then the old wolf sat down, pointed his nose at the moon, and broke out the long wolf howl. The others sat down and howled, and now the call came clearly to Buck. He too sat down and howled, and when he finished he came out of his angle, and the pack crowded around him, sniffing in a half-friendly, half-savage manner. The leader sounded the yelp of the pack, and they sprang away into the woods. The wolves swung in behind, yelping in a chorus, and Buck ran with them, side by side with the wild brother, yelping as he ran. And here well may end the story of Buck. It was not many years before the Yeehats noticed a change in the breed of timber wolves. Some had splashes of brown on their head and their muzzle, with a patch of white centering down the chest. But more remarkable than this, the Yeehats tell of a ghost dog that run at the head of the pack. They were afraid of this ghost dog, for it had a cunning greater than they. It steals from their camp in the fiercest of winters, robs their traps, and slays their dogs, and challenges their bravest of hunters. And there is more to this story. There are hunters who fail to return to camp. There have been hunters found by their tribesmen with throats slashed cruelly open, and with wolf prints about them in the snow greater than the prints of any wolf. Each fall, when the Yeehats follow the movement of the moose, there is a certain valley which they never enter. And there are women who become sad when it is told by the fire of how an evil spirit came to select that valley for a dwelling place. In the summer there is one visitor, however, to the valley in which the Yeehats do not know. It is a great glorious coated wolf, like, and yet not like, all the other wolves. He crosses alone from the smiling timberland and comes down upon an open space among the trees. Here a yellow stream flows from the rotten moose-hide sacks and sinks into the ground. Long grass grows through it, and the vegetable mold runs over it and hides its yellow from the sun. Here he dreams of a time, howling once, long and mournfully, before he leaves. But he is not always alone, and when the long winter nights come on and the wolves follow their meat into the lower valley, he may be seen running at the head of the pack. Through the pale moonlight or the glimmering northern lights, he leaps like a giant above his fellows, his great throat singing the song of the younger world, which is the song of the pack.